Olá a todos e todas, sejam muito bem-vindos. Vocês que já me conhecem, eu vou me apresentar rapidamente de novo. Eu sou Juliana Seidel, sou psicóloga e gostaria só de fazer uma breve introdução, porque quem está participando hoje desse encontro se inscreveu para fazer o workshop e a palestra voltado para a discussão sobre o teste da Lowlands Assessment Systems, né? Como a gente gosta de chamar, Lola. Então, vocês tiveram a oportunidade de participar do workshop no dia 6 de outubro, que teve como objetivo discutir o potencial do teste Lola para o desenvolvimento de carreiras. E, infelizmente, a gente teve um probleminha com a internet do Filip no dia, então hoje a gente vai fazer a palestra dele, tá? Eu vou passar os slides aqui e ele já vai entrar. E como a palestra dele é em inglês, ele não fala português, os slides estão em português. Se vocês tiverem qualquer dúvida, vocês podem escrever no chat. E aí, ao final, eu vou repassar as dúvidas para ele e vou respondê-las em português. Tá bom? Aproveitem a palestra e sejam muito bem-vindos.
Thank you so much, Juliana, for this nice introduction. My name is Filip de Fruyt. I'm an academic professor at Ghent University, and I'm also a business developer at Lowlands Assessment Systems, and I'm also connected to EduLab 21 of the Institute Ayrton Senna, where I help and advise people in the institute with setting up studies on education in Brazil, more specifically in public education. From a background, I'm a psychologist, and I have been interested already for a long time in assessment issues. So Juliana, about 10 days ago, introduced one of the instruments I have been working on, Lola. And in addition to that, I'm also giving from time to time keynotes for organizations. And today, I would love to talk to you about a very ambitious project, actually, about human resources challenge to design and implement career development programs for everyone in the organization. So I think in the talk of today, I will talk about 5 main themes. Can I have the next slide? So first of all, I will start by outlining a little bit what the current challenges on the labor market are. We have a bunch of specific problems, and that bring me to a couple of interesting questions. First of all, I will talk with you about the kind of skills that are necessary today on the labor market, but also in education, because in education we try to prepare students for the labor market, of course, and also for their personal lives. A third theme I would love to discuss with you is, in addition to the skills, we always need to apply the skills in a particular domain, in a particular field. And then the main question is in what domain we need to develop these skills. And then finally, I would love to finish the talk. By the end of the talk, I will actually discuss talent management and talent development at the level of the individual. Many of you who attended the previous workshop by Juliana are actually career counselors, where you work with individual people, with individual customers, where you deal with their career issues, with their career questions. And this is basically what we will talk about here. And then I will wrap up and at the end of the talk about how we can organize actually talent management and career learning, career development in an organization. Yeah, so I'll cover these 5 main themes. I'm so sorry, and my apologies again. For last time, I was running this kind of talk out of my hotel in Rio de Janeiro, and it had been a very nice day. And what happens if it's a nice day? People take a lot of pictures and small movies, and then they come in the hotel in the evening and they start sending all these nice pictures and movies to their families across the world. And we, of course, needed all the bandwidth of the internet to run the talk, and that went quite difficult. So my apologies again, and I hope it is much, much better this time. Okay, let me start with the first main theme, the current challenges at the labor market. I think I don't have to say you that we are living in a kind of disruptive world. We have had the pandemic. Here in Europe, we are facing all the consequences of the war in Ukraine. So that creates a series of challenges, not only economically, but also for the current labor market. On top of all this, we have in very different countries, sometimes in institutions, we have our political issues. You guys in Brazil are just facing the elections, which put the country always in a difficult position. We have the climate issues we are facing. We are facing in many societies a bunch of social inequalities. In the States, you have the racial issues still going on. Also in Brazil, you have a mixture of very, very different groups living there together. In Western Europe, we have a huge refugee problem for the moment. And in many, many countries, we have at the one side a huge unemployment. For Brazil, that's a very, very large number of people who are unemployed. And at the same time, we see that there are also many vacancies. So we see a kind of mismatch between, on the one hand, people who are looking for employment, on the other hand, all different sorts of positions that are not filled up. On top, we need many, many different literacies today on the labor market. We all know that we are highly dependent more and more on information technology. For example, we are running this meeting here or this talk here. I'm in my home office. I came back from Brazil over the weekend, and I'm running this out of my office here. So a lot of technology, information technology, and so on is involved in much of the work we are doing. But on top of that, it's not only ICT literacy that we need, but also, for example, financial literacy. That will become a very important one to survive in the future and on the future labor market. On top, we are facing longer careers. I put here on the slide from 18 to 67. That's when we can retire here in Belgium. But the bottom line is that if young people come on the labor market, they are facing more or less a career of about 50 years. So it's highly unlikely that we will survive in our careers with the knowledge and just with the skills that we got and learned in school. So we will have to continuously develop and continuously learn. On top of that, we work more from home. That was accelerated by COVID. We are living longer, we retire later, retirement plans are an important thing, and so on and so forth. So we have changing economies. We have a world economy. For example, you guys in Brazil, you are responsible for feeding 1 in 5 people in the world, which is huge. So the economies are very, very dependent on each other. Here, for example, in the Western world, we are very, very dependent more and more on China for all different sorts of electronic equipment and so on. So it's really about the world economy we are talking. And the jobs of today will be are very different than the jobs which will be there tomorrow. Some estimates are saying that 40% of the future jobs will actually be completely new. Yeah. So people who are in jobs today will probably have to rethink what they will do in the future. So that's good news for you career counselors. But on the other hand, we also will have to think how we will better do this and how we will prepare people to make this kind of transition, and how we will especially make our organizations ready for this kind of transition. So many people are starting about upskilling, reskilling, with as a central question how to keep our employees and how to keep the people employable. In addition to that, we will always need also very good craftsmen. For example, in the country where I'm living, this is really a big, big problem, having good craftsmen. We have many, many universities who are providing us with enough academically trained people on the labor market, but having people who can actually repair your toilet when there's a problem there, it's very, very hard to find people. There are long waiting lists if you call them, and so on and so forth. So we will also have to invest there. On top, we will need to foster that people take ownership of their careers. We are sometimes thinking, I'm a university professor, and I always hope that my students actually are behind the steering wheel of their own career car, so to speak. So they are empowered and take responsibility and take ownership of their own career. We are also facing specific groups. I listed here a few of these. For example, the people aged 50 plus, 50 years and older, that's a very big group. For example, if you look at the total population in Brazil, about 50 million people in Brazil are 50 plus. Yeah? Not all of them are on the labor market, but as you know, if we have to work until we are 67, that means that many people who are over their 50s and who lose their jobs, or who are bored in their jobs, or who got a burnout, well, they still need 15 years or 16, 7 years of work. On top, we also have in many societies people with chronic illnesses or people with a burnout and who have a higher risk actually to lag behind. So we will really need all of them to work in one or another way in jobs that they are still that they can still do, that are still fit for them, for their capacities, for their interests, and so on. On top, we also have to think about, and this is what I learned from my work with the Instituto Ayrton Senna for education in Brazil, that there's that dropout in schools in Brazil is a really big problem. If the children are dropping out of schools, we actually lose them in terms of trying to influence them, trying to learn them, and trying to prepare them for the labor market of tomorrow. So to wrap up from a policy perspective, I think we will need to work and think about careers at the level of the individual, so people take ownership of their career. Second, also organizations will have a main responsibility. So those of you who are working as human resources officers in organizations, you will have a high responsibility actually, and you will probably need to be the educators of the adults on their path on the labor market. If they already have left education, it will be the organizations who will be responsible for training people, for learning people, and for their development. And finally, the government and the politicians, of course, they will have to provide the necessary support so, and individuals and the organizations actually can take ownership and can develop. Next slide, please. So if you are looking to the human resources cycle in organizations in the past and today, you see that there are some differences. At the left side, you see the situation, how the HR cycle, the human resources cycle in an organization actually was a number of years ago. And I think you could distinguish three main pieces in there. One, selection. Secondly, performance evaluation. And then three, development. These were three main pillars that HR people needed to focus on when implementing human resources policies in organizations. First of all, let me talk a little bit about selection. So they try to attract people to fill up a certain vacancy in an organization, and then they had to design a kind of selection procedure where they really looked at a range of different competencies that a candidate had to have in order to fit in that particular position. Then the candidate started in the firm, and after 3 months or 6 months, then a performance evaluation was done. Yeah, where either the candidate was accepted and he or she could continue in the organization, or if the evaluation was not so good, developmental points were either indicated or eventually the candidate left even the organization. This kind of evaluation was actually a kind of evaluation more about past performance of the candidate in the organization. And it was more narrowly focused on the performance and on the competencies of the candidate. Learning and development at that time in organizations was really learning and development mainly organized for about 10% of the people in the organization. Usually the majority of the organizations had two types of specific development plans. One way of learning and developing was more in the context of what I would call a kind of succession planning, where they actually thought about how to replace key figures in the organization. Assume that someone is leaving the organization and he or she has a rather critical position in the organization. So we would be sure that we would have at least one of two people ready in the organization so they could step in. Yeah. A second way of learning and development was investing in what was called a kind of a high potential program. They identified often young people who were coming into the organization, identified as high potentials, and they were going through a kind of learning development cycle within the organization. Often they were put in 3-4 different functions, each time for 3 to 4 months, and then they had done the entire organization, gained a little of experience within the organization, and these were then called the high potentials. Now, many of these learning programs were not really top successful because many of these high potentials, of course, left the organization. And also the people who were not in the high potential program, they said, well, if there was some extra to do in the organization, they just replied and said, well, ask it to the high potentials, because they went to the expensive management course or to the expensive leadership course. So that was more the situation before. The situation nowadays still contains these three main pillars, but the situation got a little more complex. Today's the organizations need to do a lot more effort to attract people to apply for the jobs. If I'm talking to people here, before leaving to Brazil a couple of weeks ago, I had a couple of contacts with business people here in Western Europe, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in France, and all of them were uniformly complaining that it was very, very hard to attract people to apply for jobs. So they moved from external recruitment also more to internal recruitment within the organization. So making your organization attractive so people apply is a very important one. I'll come back to that later. Selection then is still using the selection and the assessment battery of tools and methods that was used before, but what you see that on top already when selecting people, we also look and explore in a much broader way about people's potential to fit in the organization, but also to have a future in the organization. So when people are selected, we are not selecting them just to fit in a particular function that we have in mind, but these functions, now we realize this, these functions can change so quickly across time that we are more recruiting people for a longer life in the organization. So that actually means that we need to explore more broadly what could be drivers of people, what could interest them, what talent they have that could be useful today or eventually later on in the organization. So the scope around selection changed, and selection and actually development go more hand in hand. Already when people come into the organization, we design a kind of developmental plan. And then, of course, like before, after 3 months or after 6 months, we do a performance evaluation. But the performance evaluation, rather than looking behind in terms of what they have done, we try to look more ahead, and we try to make this performance evaluation more future-oriented. Yeah, and that is then translated again in new learning and development objectives. New learning and development objectives, not for 10% of the people in the organization anymore, but learning and development objectives for everyone in the organization. Because we are really convinced today that if organizations want to survive in the future on the economic market, that we will have to be very, very flexible, and that we will have to invest in learning and developing for all in the organizations. So this is a little bit the HR cycle that is today an important piece in organizations with the differences, how that was organized in the past. And here you see that the how question of performance is indicated in red, the how of performance, where the focus is on assessing people's competencies. This is really in selection and in performance evaluation. But you see that the second main question, in what domains we will perform, in what fields we will perform, the what and the where questions indicated in green, that we will have to use new tools to go into this direction. Yeah. So I think in the HR cycle, we already have a lot, but on top of that, due to these new challenges, we will have to focus also on new instruments. Okay, so what kind of skills are necessary? This is a question that many of you are dealing with customers, and those of you who are working as career counselors. People come to you and people say, hey, I've been working in this kind of job for 5 to 10 years, and then they come with a job title to you, and you will really have to help them in exploring, in translating this kind of job title into different skills they might have. Yeah. Can I have the next slide? And this is exactly one of the problematic issues that we were facing in the past. What kind of skill model actually to use? We want to use a skill model that is broadly applicable with career counselor clients, but also in organizations. Those organizations who want to prepare for the future as an HR professional, you really need to think about what kind of skill model, what kind of competency model, however you want to name it, what kind of model will you use that provides enough detail about what you will need in the future. And if you go to the internet and if you Google and if you plug in search terms such as VUCA world, skills for the future, 21st century skills, transferable skills, soft skills, although I don't like the name soft skills, there's nothing soft about soft skills. Yeah, sometimes they are hard to learn, so I prefer to call them social emotional skills or transferable skills. If you Google this, well, then this is what you get, what you see on the screen. And I can show you multiple extra screens with all different sorts of models. It goes from the 4C model, where what you see on the left side, a critical thinker, communicator, collaborator, creator, to skill models that actually contain 200 different skills. So the major problem is, what do you need to use in your professional practice then? And that was a challenge, actually. Can I have the next slide? A challenge that we also faced with the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development a number of years ago. The OECD asked my colleague Oliver John and myself to study all these different models and actually to suggest and come up with a kind of comprehensive model that could be used a little bit as the largest common denominator of all these different skill models. So the challenge was to be as comprehensive as possible, but at the same time land with a kind of structured model that contained almost all the important skills that the other individual models were mentioning. And this is actually the result of this work. This is what we call the social emotional 5, and you see that the heart of the model is actually built around 5 main boxes of skills. Task performance, which groups all the kind of skills that are related to performing, to doing stuff at work. In addition, we have engaging with others and collaboration. Engaging with others is more referring to skills that have to do with initiating contact with people, being assertive, speak up, but also energizing skills, optimism goes in there. Collaboration, then, that's another box of interpersonal skills which are more quality oriented. We are talking here about respect, skills of respect, skills of building trust, skills of building a team, skills of empathy. Yeah. And then we have a fourth group, open-mindedness, which is also a very important one when you are thinking, for example, about innovation. Curiosity goes in there, tolerance or working, being open to diversity, working with people of other cultures, but also creativity. And finally, a fifth group of skills, groups actually skills which have to do with emotion regulation. Not everything in life goes well. Sometimes we need to deal with frustration, with setbacks. Sometimes we are facing a difficult task we don't know how to do, and then we need emotion regulation skills as well. So these 5 main groups, and you see that these 5 main groups contain more specific skills, are actually the heart of the OECD model. And this is, for example, the kind of skill model that you can use with your customers when you, for example, are exploring their interests, and then you can see with each interest domain, do they also have the skills actually to perform in such a skill domain, in such an interest domain, excuse me. Yeah. So here we have 2 very important pieces, and this is what we have been translating and using for education in Brazil as well. And on the next slide here, you see how we translated that in labels and in a skill model together with my colleagues at EduLab 21 of the Institute Ayrton Senna. And we use this kind of skill model in education, but you can use it, of course, the same skill model for adults as well. So here you have another nice picture where we have the 5 main groups that you can see here, and within these groups we learn the students that there are also more specific skills that they can use, for example, to solve specific problems. If you want to read more about this, I'm very, very happy. We published extensively already on this. I'm happy to send you definitions. I'm happy to link you to literature on that and to papers, so you can document yourself much more on the topic. So here we have a kind of, can I have the next one? Here we have a nice bridge actually between what we can do in education. Next slide, please. What we can do in education and what is next. Next one. Yes. So here we have a nice step up from what we can do in education to the labor market. What do we need to develop in education? And you guys in Brazil had a long discussion about all this the past years with all the discussions on the BNCC. What of these social emotional skills should be represented and reflected in an education curriculum? So you can evaluate that curriculum and see if students are prepared to go to the labor market. At the same time, those of you who are working in organizations can use this kind of model to develop the skills of their workforce, of the employees working in your organizations. Yeah? So you know what to develop in terms of skills in education and at work. The missing piece, however, is in what kind of domain you will use these skills, in what kind of domain, content domain, you will apply these skills. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so far, the next one, please. Can you click? Yeah. So far in HR, there was really a strong focus on competencies and on skills. Selection really focused, and also performance evaluation really focused on skill levels of people. However, there was less attention for what I would call the drivers of people. What people really like to do. This is a very important one. And due to the pandemic, luckily, there's more attention for this, but actually it's a little bit of a pity that we needed the pandemic to realize that we need to pay more attention to what are the real drivers of people to get out of their bed in the morning and to go to their jobs, and what they really find stimulating, interesting, exciting in the work they do. Yeah. On top of all this, we did not have too much attention in human resources for what people bring additionally to the job. Let me explain that a little bit more. Usually we are interested in filling up a particular vacancy, and then we look at some competencies that are necessary for adequate performance in that specific job vacancy. However, people bring to the workplace much, much more than that specific kind of competencies. Sometimes they have interests that they do in their free time, or interests that are not really used actually in the job they are doing, that might be very interesting in the long run for the organization. Yeah. So we had a little bit of a too narrow focus on the abilities and the competencies and the skills of the people we were working with. Yeah. I would love to see is that we gain a broader perspective of this, because people bring more to the work environment than only the kind of competencies that we were assessing in selection in the past. A third main element is that we need to plead guilty here as well. Psychologists usually they are very, very strongly focusing on the individual and on characteristics of the individual. However, we also need to focus at the level of the environment, at the level of the job. It's always about a person working in a particular environment. Yeah. And I argued already for 20 years ago that we need to do a bigger effort in terms of building environments around people. So you really trigger actually in people what they are good in, what their drivers are. Now with a technical term we call this job crafting, but I think already for 20 years, I have been arguing that we needed to think about and the person and the environment, and that we need to do much more of an effort of building environments around people rather than just trying to fit a person in an environment. Often you do not have too many options to change at the level of the person, but you have often more options at the level of the environment to optimize what he or she likes or is good at doing or not. Yeah. So, and also we need to learn, we need to focus more on learning. Learning and development is a critical piece of HR of the future. So much of the material that we are working with will stay in organizations. We will stay working and remain working with assessments of competencies, skills, personality traits, abilities. But on top of that, we will also look in what field people will love to apply all this. And this brings us to vocational interests. There are multiple reasons why vocational interests will become more important. One reason is that vocational interests are, of course, very important to understand people's well-being, people's satisfaction. That's already clear from John Holland's theory. If you are interested in something and interested in a particular kind of environment to work in, then there's a higher likelihood that you will be satisfied in your job. If the job brings you what you find interesting, well, this kind of matching is associated with job satisfaction. Vocational interests will also become very, very important to orient people within the organization. Think about what I've said about selection and development go hand in hand already when people come in the organization. Often, people are oriented or reoriented further within the organization depending on their vocational interests, depending on where they are good at, or what they love to do, or the opposite, what they don't like to do. Yeah? So job crafting will be an important piece of future human resources practices. And that reorientation can be, of course, within the organization, but also outside of the organization. So that provides us an enormous window for learning. An enormous opportunity for learning, where we capitalize on what people love to do and like to do. And this should not necessarily always be learning, which is directly related to something which is beneficial for the organization. I think that's a very important piece. The most important piece is that people learn, yeah? So their brains are still trained in terms of learning. If you stop learning in 10 years, it will be very, very difficult to start after 10 years to learn something new, yeah? So I prefer that they learn something, whatever it is. If it has a direct benefit for the organization, it's good. If it does not have a direct benefit for the organization, I'm happy as well because they learn. They use their brain and they keep the plasticity of their brain. And then finally, vocational interests will also become very important because they predict performance, as you can see on the next slide. It has been always a little bit outside of the scope of many organizational psychologists because in the past some people came with a meta-analysis where only a few studies were included, and they showed actually that interests were unrelated to performance. That was the past. New meta-analysis, and there are numerous. I'm only listing one here of our colleague Chris Nye, Rong Su, Jim Rounds, and Fritz Drasgo. A very important piece of work which nicely illustrates across a large set of studies that interests, and especially a congruency measure, where you look at interests in an environment. So you can compute the fit or the congruency of the interest measure together with the environment, that this correlates nicely with task performance, organizational citizenship behavior, persistence, and also negatively with counterproductive work behavior. You can see that on the next slide. For example, if you look into this table, you will really see on top, you see task performance, you see organizational citizenship behavior. That's a kind of variable which describes everything people do in an organization, which is just outside of their strict task description, but helps in realizing the objectives of the organization. For example, if one of your colleagues is sick, that you step in and that you help each other out. This is what we would call organizational citizenship behavior. Yeah, it's not directly in your task description what you need to do, but it helps in realizing the broader objectives of the organization. Persistence is really about continuing in the job, and then counterproductive work behavior. We do not want to see this in organizations, so we should expect negative correlations there. But you see, if you look at across very different interest scales, the self-directed search, the COODER, the strong interest inventory, and a bunch of others, you see positive correlation coefficients if you look at interests itself, but these are not dramatically high. But if you look at a congruency index, where you look at someone's interest scores, whether they are congruent with the environment where they are in, and you compute an index on that, that this in particular is positively correlated with task performance, organizational citizenship, behavior, persistence. And this is across studies, across very different designs of the studies, cross-sectionally, longitudinally, across single occupations, multiple occupations, and so on and so forth. Can I have the next one? So here you see also the results from the same meta-analysis, but now if we look at academic performance, also in education, interests are very important. And again, here the congruency index actually outperforms the single interest scores across the different measures and across study characteristics. You see that the congruency index is related to persist in an academic program, the 1 year after the other. So you finish your degree, and also in terms of the grades obtained, in terms of academic achievement, you see that the congruency index correlates with this outcome. So interests do predict something, and they do probably equally better like cognitive capacity or like personality. Yeah. So interests really matter for a number of reasons that I was just mentioning. Okay, next slide. So 10 days ago, Juliana already introduced you to what I think is a nice tool to assess vocational interests. She gave you a nice introduction and a hands-on workshop on the Lola inventory. Next slide. So Lola has a couple of specific features, I guess. Here you see a picture of the 3 people who initially made the inventory. So we are working not only on John Holland's RIASEC model, but we expanded the model with 16 components under each of or under the 6 main domains, which gives you a much more refined structure of interests for consultancy and for advice situations. This is really important. We also worked with the 2 levels of interests. If you remember this, we are talking about the more superficial interests, the things that people say, oh yeah, I want to do this, I want to try this once. But at the same time, we are also interested in the more anchored interests. Yeah. So these are the interests where people actually are pretty sure about, and also have, they still want to do it, taking into account potential negative consequences it might have. For example, if you say, I love to work outdoors, this is probably easy to endorse when the sun is shining. But if you say, I love working outdoors, even when it's raining, well, then you really, this kind of interest is a more anchored interest, because this is not the activity under optimal conditions. You take into account that it can be cold, that it can be rainy, windy, and so on. Yeah. And then we try to come up with actionable reports. So there are many interest inventories available also in Brazil, but I think Lola really makes a difference, because we have this kind of refined structure of interests. We have these 2 levels of interests, anchored versus the more superficial ones. We have the change indicator, which is really a critical piece. And then we try to come up with actionable reports, and for the customer and for the professional. Yeah. So next slide. I don't go I only go very quickly over this, because this is has been dealt with before. Here you, as a recap, here you see the refined structure. Next slide. Here you see it presented in our report form. For example, for the realistic domain, we have 3 subdivisions: handcraft, physical activities, a score on outdoor activities, and then a score on interests which have to do with mechanics and with broad and construction work. Yeah. And that all goes in, next slide, that all goes into a report which gives you, the next one please, which gives you a very broad overview on a bunch of indicators with text blocks and so on and so forth. So please go back if you want to have extra information. I can certainly recommend you all our tutorials. Juliana is busy with translating all of them to Portuguese, so please take a look at these. I think they are very, very interesting to learn about the richness of the vocational interest model that Lola is covering. Okay, can I have the next one? That brings me to talent management from the perspective of the individual. Now we have a skill model. We know what we can use there. We have a model that we can use to look at where people want to work. And then we need to think from the perspective of the individual, how can we as career coaches help the individual to explore his or her career options? So if you are looking to the problem from an individual career coaching perspective, I think that the main responsibility here is to keep people employable in the long run. So that means that they take responsibility for their career and that we empower them to do so. One of the critical pieces of the Lola reports is really to help people in using a kind of vocabulary to talk about where they want to work. Not only in terms of what their interests are, but also in terms of work environments. This is what you guys know better than I do. If you talk to customers, not everyone has the right language to talk about what he or she likes in a job. I think a model like Lola's model and the components in there really provide you a vocabulary to interact with your customer for this kind of exercise. And on top, you empower them. Once they learn this, you empower them for the future to talk about what they like in a job and to talk about what they like with their employers in a job. So I think it's not only the assessment piece which is interesting, but it's also about the language it provides you. Yeah. And the same for the skills. Usually people come to you and say, I've worked for 10 years in the job of. Your task will be to translate what they have done in terms of a skill language. I think the model I showed you that we developed for the OECD and that we are also using with the Instituto Ayrton Senna is really, really well designed also to provide the vocabulary that your people can use, your customers can use, and that you, in connection with your customer and client, can use to talk about skills. Yeah. So the vocabulary piece is one. So the practice of career coaching is a lot about exploring possibilities, be a soundboard for your client, and usually with an open-end result. Sometimes people go for another job, sometimes people stay in the job, but at least they have considered their options. Let me give you an example of good practice that maybe some of you may find inspiring that the Belgian government is already rolling out for a couple of years here. It's called a system, it's a sort of system of career vouchers. Here in Belgium, if you have a job, every 6 years you can get 7 hours of career coaching. And the system works pretty nicely. You, as an employee, pay a very, very small amount. It's about €40 for 4 hours of career coaching, and the government actually, on top of that, is bypassing the extra amount. Yeah. So it's a very interesting and a very low threshold system to really help people to start thinking about their careers. Yeah? So it's not to encourage people to change or to make big changes in their career, but it's a low threshold way of helping and empowering people, providing them some help to start thinking about, is this job still something for me? Am I ready for a next move within the organization or outside of the organization, and so on and so forth. So it's a very successful thing. Of course, the career coaches love it as well because it provides them a very nice step up. The employee pays a very small part, and on top of that, the government is bypassing of the money. So organizers like ABOP in grouping the career counselors in Brazil, this would be a lovely opportunity to suggest, I think, to your government. There are, of course, a number of points to improve. This kind of system here in Belgium only works if you have a job. So I think we also need to expand that to people who are unemployed. There are some complaints on the quality of the service. Not every career coach, of course, is equally well or equally well equipped to do this. So there is some fine-tuning still to do there, and there's still a financial burden to some. Although it's a small amount, some people are still complaining that it should be all for free. Next slide. So I think that also organizations need to encourage their employees actually to take benefit of a system like this. You need to make this system transparent and come up or suggest a kind of system with a very low threshold. Of course, you need to impose quality restrictions to coaching providers. So I think the way to do it is to build a kind of network of individual coaches. For example, we could think about developing such a network with the people who attended the workshop on October 6th. For example, we could make a kind of network that is connected, for example, to Lowlands, where we provide the assessments. We guarantee you quality assessments, and you can, on top of that, provide your services. And maybe Juliana with Longiva could organize a kind of supervising system where we meet on a timely basis to discuss a couple of Lola profiles or give some extra training. So we are really increasing the quality of the kind of service that everyone is providing. We could provide you with the assessment piece, and you guys could build a kind of network of career coaches. And we can help each other out, and we can guarantee the quality of everything. Yeah, I think assessment should be part of all this. Here we see too many career counselors who are still working just with interviews and talking to people, and then they ask to people, what gives you energy, or can you tell me what really takes your energy? But this is not a systematic coverage of all different assessment, of all the different options that people could have in a decent vocational interest assessment. The only way to get there is through using good instruments like Lola, for example. Yeah. So the further steps in all this is that we need to set up a kind of common training initiatives, build this kind of network. So if some of you are interested in doing this, that would be fine. It's also a good idea to connect such a network to businesses who are selling temporary work, because then, of course, if people are thinking about changing or about moving, we can immediately go to a big data bank where acquired competencies through experience are already in there, and then we can match those who want to change or who want to make a move. We really know the direction in which they want to move. We can relate this to work that is available, or temporary work providers have a good idea where really requests and demands are for this kind of labor. So building on such a network, I think, is one of the main challenges for the future, where we can do good assessment, combine that with individual coaching, and then link that to a big database with available work. Yeah. Okay, next one. So what about, that's my final piece, what about organizations? How can we realize actually all this material in an next slide, please. How can we realize that in an organizational context? And what is really happening if we don't do all this? So in an organizational context, I already told you that attraction today is a very, very critical piece. And then, of course, selection is there. Transformation is really about transforming the individual. That's really the learning piece. Whereas manipulation is manipulate more the kind of tasks or the kind of environmental pieces in the job that people will be doing. And if this is not a fit, then people what we call attrition go out of this. So this is nicely summarized in the ASMA model. And I think this is an important piece to think about. Think about what I told you about the new HR cycle with very different pieces where attraction is a main one, but also where development has a very, very central role. So the next element is that we stopped more and more in organizations with looking actually for these applicants who are almost superheroes. In Dutch and in English, there's an expression which is called looking for a sheep with 5 legs. As you know, the majority of the sheep only have 4 legs, but if you read many of these job advertisements, actually, I'm always a bit scared if I'm reading this because I see that they are looking for 10 to 12 different competencies. And in all honesty, I'm working already for 35 years now, and usually I'm meeting 3 or 4 of these competencies. So I'm always asking myself, who is actually having all these different competencies combined in a single individual? So I think we need to stop with looking for a sheep with 5 legs. We need to be much more modest in what we are looking for. And we really need to make a kind of decision on what are really must-haves, usually 2 to 3 main characteristics that are really necessary for the organization, to collaborate. And this is what I'm always calling the common core in an organization, what you really need to have to work together with the other people, and everything then on top, which are more, it's nice to have this, but not a must-have, because otherwise we will be faced with a double loss. People will not apply, they will not be attracted to come to work in our organization, and we lose them. And at the same time, it's a double loss because if they don't show up, they don't learn within the organization. So it's actually a double loss. It's a loss for them, it's a loss for the organization. So usually in the past, we were really looking for very homogeneous groups of people in organizations. The majority of the selection procedures was designed to select out people who did not really fit in this kind of homogeneous pattern. Nowadays, I think organizations really go for the must-haves. There's some homogeneity still there, but on top of that, they are looking for heterogeneity. Because heterogeneity will help you to deal better with challenges you will meet in the future. Heterogeneity will also help you much better in solving the new issues that will come up. New jobs, new challenges, new people to work with, new customers, and so on and so forth. External recruitment will shift also to more internal recruitment. In the past, people were thinking, oh, if we have a new vacancy, we will recruit from external. Well, this is done. Here in Europe, you see a lot of investment to keep people in an organization. So internal recruitment means that we really have, if we select people, we need to select and think about their development. Development is actually the new selection, or the other way around even. And another main change is that we see a kind of shift in terms of a shift from looking at the individual to looking more how the individual works in a team. And the past years we have seen that there's even an extra challenge, how to work in a team when we are working remotely. Yeah? So many of the things we do, we are dependent on others. So teamwork is, I think, an important piece. And then if we need to work from home or we need to work remotely, this is a big challenge. So you see a series of challenges where I think talent development program can provide the answer. Next slide. What if we do not focus or if we do not invest in talent management or in talent development? I think it's a dead end and probably soon. Yeah. Next slide. So how can actually Lola and how can vocational interests actually help you in this talent management process? And I think they can help you in very different ways. I think that interests are all about what get people into jobs. If people are interested in, then they will apply to your organization. So the idea of using interests to attract people to your organization is a very important one. Yeah. Interests are also about what keeps people in jobs. So interests are also, I think, a very main piece to study retention. In the pandemic, when I talked to business people, one of their most important fears was that people would leave organizations. We have seen this kind of movement in the States. We have seen it less here in the country where I'm living, but there was a big fear that people would leave organizations. So I think that interests have an important function there to study and to learn what keeps people in jobs. We have seen in the meta-analysis that interests also tell us something about performance. So interests are what make people good at their jobs as well. And finally, interests are what drive people to change. Also, when we are interested in studying mobility in organizations, mobility is often related to interests of people. Learning, just the same. Don't ask someone to learn something that he or she is not interested in. Learning should always build on what people are interested in. Yeah, that's the best guarantee. Learning, curiosity, building on something they are interested in gives you the best basis for results. Yeah. Next slide, please. So I think we talked about Lola as a tool that could do the job there. I think the big advantage of working with this system of 16 components is that we have a more advanced understanding of what really makes people happy in their jobs. In the past, we only had these 6 domains. Now we have really 16 pieces of information that really gives us information, more information for our analysis and an interview, or that provides us more input if we need to think about a new job, about the reorientation of someone, or about job crafting. So in the end, working with this kind of system will result in higher quality advice. Can I have the next one? So I think Lola is also a partner in strategic talent management when it comes to talent acquisition, in terms of recruiting, in terms of attracting people. And here you see an example of a job advertisement where one actually refers to interests. When one does not come up with an extensive list of skills or competencies that people need to have, but they define content domains. A passion for data and IT with an interest in financial consultancy. Yeah. And then you can really see in the Lola profile if the person actually is really interested in information technology or not. For example, the person here is certainly not interested in that because he or she has a low score on information technology. Financial consultancy in the conventional domain, we have something about money, cost saving, this kind of interest field, but also in the entrepreneurial area, that gives you a little bit of a taste if someone could have this kind of interest or not. So Lola can also help you in terms of recruiting, in terms of talent acquisition. Can I have the next one? So Lola can further help also in talent retention and engagement. When people leave the organization, usually we do these kind of exit interviews just to learn about what is the reason why they are leaving us. Maybe they had another job opportunity, but sometimes they say, well, I dislike this in the current job, what I'm doing right now, or that could have been done better, or and so on and so forth. So rather than doing these kind of exit interviews, I think using a vocational interest profile of someone, if you have a Lola profile of someone, this is really a very good step up to talk about what he or she likes in the current job or would love to see maximized or minimized in the current job. So rather than doing these exit interviews, I think we need to be more proactive in our approach, and we need to focus more on stay interviews. And the input for a stay interview could be given by a Lowlands assessment. A Lola assessment actually gives you really the drivers of someone, and you can see if the drivers are currently already in the job, or if we can do something to maximize one driver or minimize something that the person dislikes. Next slide, please. Finally, also Lola as a partner in strategic talent management on talent mobility. If you want to rotate people in the organization or reorient people in the organization, I think Lola can be very, very helpful. Bart and Shurt and I are working now also on a job crafting tool connected to our assessment. So that will be very interesting. So people can actually say and indicate what they want more or what they want less in the kind of job they are doing right now. Also for the people working as career counselors, I think this could be a very, very nice tool and input for the future. So we hope to see you in one of the future workshops that we can do together with Longeva, where we will have the opportunity then to work with these new developments. But that will take still some extra time. Next slide, please. And then finally, we can also use vocational interests for talent development. I was already arguing that talent development and learning should actually build on what people like. I think this is really the important criterion for having success of learning and development. Don't come with something that people are not interested in, but start from people's interests and build on that for your upskilling or reskilling kind of program. Next slide. So to recap and give a summary, I'm coming to the end here. We talked about 5 main things. I started with outlining a little bit the contours and all the different challenges we have at the current labor market and how the HR cycle actually shifted to try to better capture all these challenges. In order to deal with these challenges, we will need to have agreement upon a good skill model that we can use. But these skills alone won't be sufficient. It's also in life about content fields. You can have 2 people with almost the same skill set, but the one can use his skills, for example, in medicine, the other one can use his or her skills in a field like engineering. So the content fields are also very important. And to get an idea on this, I think that John Holland's vocational interest model is the best option to go there. So in addition to the skill model, I introduced you to the Holland model and to an extension of the Holland model assessed by Lola. And then we explored how talent management actually can take benefit of these skill development models and of these content models. How individual talent management can be centered around that, and also how an organization can use these two different inputs to build into a talent management program for the organization. I think it will be a matter of bringing everyone on board. It's really a kind of exercise of and the client and the career coach and the employees and HR and the organization as a whole. I think it's really a matter of being all on board, what I would call no employee left behind, learning and development for everyone in the organization. So we really create what I would call a kind of inclusive organizations where everyone is working on a particular developmental issue and where everyone is learning. So thank you very much for your attention. If you want to contact me, usually at the end, can I have the next slide? Yeah. I have a slide here with my email address. You can connect with me through LinkedIn. You can like the Lowlands web page or the LinkedIn page. Also the one of Longiva, Juliana, with whom we are partnering in Brazil. If some of you are interested in working with us on building to get in touch with us to discuss opportunities. And I think we still have some time for questions. So I would love to open the floor for questions. If you have a difficulty in bringing the question in English, no worries. Juliana will try to translate. Yeah. If it doesn't work, just put your question to me by email, and I can always translate it. Put it in Portuguese, no problem. Thank you so much for your attention.
Olá, pessoal. Boa tarde. Mais uma vez, Felipe, muito obrigada pela palestra. Eu achei super clara, sempre aprendo contigo. A gente interagiu um pouco aqui no chat, algumas pessoas estiveram ao vivo, mas não foi, né, a maioria, acho que talvez por conta da troca. E, bom, aí eu não sei, pessoal, se vocês têm alguma dúvida, até agora eu não vi nenhuma pergunta. Então, a gente pode esperar mais um pouco. Ou então, talvez o Philip pode trazer algum outro exemplo. So, Philip, I'm just going to explain to you that we had around a few people here watching us live, but most people, I believe, they are going to watch the recording. And some people said they were like following your explanation. I like it pretty much. I always learn a lot with you. And I think we do have now, like, linked to the workshop, a broader view of how we can apply Lola in different contexts, right? How it is important to look at the people's interests. But until now, we had any question or doubt about it, just people asking like for the slides and the papers you mentioned. And also, like, yeah, Denise said it was very clear and assertive. So I don't know if you want to just maybe discuss another example or consultancy you have done until we just have like 15 minutes until the end, if you want to. And that's it. Or maybe we can finish a little bit before, no problem at all as well.
Yeah.
We do not have any questions by now. Let me see.
So I will share my slides. So I'll send them tomorrow, and also I will send a couple of papers. So those of you who would have trouble in finding it on the internet or on the Web of Science, I will send a couple of the papers I was referring to, so you can have access immediately to the prime sources. Yeah. And
Perfect.
if people have questions also later on, please contact us. You can either contact Jana, of course, directly, or you can contact me, and together we can work it out. You see?
Perfect. I'm gonna translate to them. Então, pessoal, o Filip comentou que, de fato, alguns artigos científicos, eles são mais complicados, né? Porque a gente precisa baixar em plataformas que são de difícil acesso, seja Scopus ou Web of Science. Então, ele vai baixar esses artigos e eu vou poder colocar lá na pasta. Apesar de que, se não me engano, a maioria dos que ele comentou, se não todos, já estão na pasta que eu compartilhei com vocês no dia seguinte. Então, foi no dia 7 de outubro, né? Nosso workshop foi no dia 6 e no dia 7 eu mandei para vocês um e-mail que tinha lá o link do workshop e tal. E essa pasta com outros estudos. E além disso, ele reforçou que se vocês tiverem outras dúvidas, vocês podem mandar para mim ou para ele por e-mail e a gente vai responder. A Denise é uma pessoa que já está aplicando, né, o Lola com seus clientes. Depois ela vai poder também dar um feedback para a gente de como é que foi. E a gente tem também já outras reuniões marcadas com alguns de vocês que solicitaram para poder compreender melhor a aplicação da ferramenta com seus próprios clientes. E é isso, a gente está à disposição para sanar todas as dúvidas. Também não sei se alguém tem alguma dúvida sobre o próprio teste, mas até agora... Ninguém colocou. Então, acho que é isso. A gente vai finalizar, então, um pouco mais cedo, já que a gente não teve dúvidas. Tá bem? Philip, I told them we are gonna finish a little bit before, as we didn't have any doubt. So, I just explained to them that you're gonna share the files and the slides and everything.
Excellent. So, if we can do something for you, please contact us. Visit our website and visit our tutorials. So I think there's interesting content over there. So we are happy to work with you guys in Brazil. I'm just back and I had really 2 very, very wonderful weeks again, talking to very different people at many different places. I was so happy to be back in Brazil after the pandemic and see many exciting things happening in education, in organizations, and I think I much enjoyed the workshop that Juliana was giving last week. I didn't have to do anything, just enjoy. And also one of my colleagues of Lowlands was following the workshop from the Netherlands. So for him, it was really late night to follow the workshop. But we both enjoyed it a lot. It's interesting to see that the content that we developed is used. We do not develop the content just to be stored somewhere here behind me. It's really content to be used by real people, and I think we really want to make a difference in the lives of people and in the future of people. Longeva and Juliana, they are mainly focusing on people who are retiring and who are what older, but others of you are focusing more on younger people, are focusing really on unemployed people. Others are focusing on people looking for re-employment. So I think there are a bunch of applications where we can share and learn from each other. So what I would love to see in the future, and then I'll stop and round up, what I would love to see in the future that we can see each other again, maybe on a workshop next year, where we can bring some more advanced content and hopefully also learn from your experiences in working with Lola. And ultimately, we want to fine-tune and further develop our program, and it's a big challenge. I know Brazil a little bit, but places are different and challenges are different across the world. And we are very happy to learn from your experiences and are open to this. For us, Brazil is an interesting market because it's a big country with many, many interesting challenges. So we are really interested to be there. But at the same time, we found it very stimulating and interesting also to learn from bringing a tool in a different culture and a different context. So we are open to this. So I hope that we can work out one or another partnership with many of you. So thanks again, obrigado, and hope to see you once in person. Huh? Once I have some more time, then I can travel around and do a kind of tour from Porto Alegre over Brasilia, São Paulo,
Perfect.
Goiás,
A good trip.
to Fortaleza. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be nice. We didn't have the chance yet to meet during your visit here to Brazil, right, Filip? So only in Maceió. So yes, I hope so. Então é isso, pessoal. Só fazendo um breve resumo do que o Filip acabou de falar, né? Caso vocês não tenham entendido. É importante que a gente lembre as diferentes opções de aplicabilidade dessa ferramenta no nível individual, né? Eu tenho aplicado, acredito que mais de 100 vezes o teste, se eu for somar a quantidade de vezes que eu apliquei na orientação de carreira individual e também oferecendo cursos sobre a importância do desenvolvimento de competências para retenção, manutenção, né, desenvolvimento na própria carreira. E é o que a gente quer, que as organizações... Acho que a palestra do Filip deixou muito claro a importância de tirarmos uma visão reducionista, que ainda existe, né, muito preocupado do fit-in, do encaixe do indivíduo à organização, e a gente olhar o contrário, olhar as possibilidades de criar novos cargos e de fazer também com que os ambientes, com que a gente possa, na verdade, encaixar aquelas pessoas que já estão lá dentro, né, da instituição, da empresa, a partir dos seus interesses e do encaixe com um tipo de cargo, de área, de ambiente de trabalho. Essa realocação interna, ela é possível. As organizações não fazem, os líderes não fazem por falta de uma visão sistêmica. E é essa também um conteúdo que a gente considera fundamental. Então, acho muito bom ter essa parceria internacional, porque a gente está sempre olhando lá na frente, né? Acho que o Brasil ainda está engatinhando com relação a esses aspectos. E é isso. Qualquer comentário, crítica, sugestão, estamos sempre abertos à Longeva e à Lowlands Assessment Systems. Muito obrigada, uma boa noite, um bom descanso e até mais. Thanks, Filip. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Obrigado.